He has a wonderful background in medicine internationally, most recently as the Dean of the Medical School at McGill, but he has been well trained in cardiology in this country. You can read more about his background in your bio, but I think he has some really interesting perspectives to share with us on medical training, interdisciplinary perspectives, and occupations to the Rignon. Dr. Levin.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. Thank you for giving up I
got to enjoy lunch.
The pleasure of giving a talk during lunch. As you heard, I've just left a lifetime in academic medicine to join the not-for-profit sector in an area which is very close to academic medicine. The Gold Foundation, for those of you who don't know about it, was invented about 25 years ago in order to make sure that humanism did not fade from the practice of medicine. Arnold Gold is a famous pediatric neurologist at Columbia who began to see in his fellows and at the time that the pendulum was swinging toward technology, and thank you, and founded this foundation, a misnomer actually, it's a public charity, to make certain that it didn't. And so they used ritual. They invented the white coat ceremony, which now exists at all medical schools in the United States, Canada, and a good number of countries overseas, and something called the Gold Humanism Honor Society to make certain that this singular mission was successful. And they've been remarkably successful, and I'm very lucky to be the first outside president of the organization. So, this title, this rather dense title that Carla and I worked out, all of the nouns could be replaced by other ones and it would still be a perfect title. So it doesn't say very much, I'm afraid. I want to talk about the special circumstances in medical schools and the management issues that relate to the progress of women in biomedical science with that bent. I met my wife at the age of 15 in 1963. It was the year in which Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. And for the next 15 years, intermingled with protests that were started over the Vietnam War and the observation of my generation that old gray-haired men did not have the answers. It was an absolutely remarkable time to go through a kind of extended puberty, a delightful time, in fact. It was also a time that changed almost everything. In time, I became the father of daughters. And those environmental conditions combined to set my epigenetic and physiologic responses, and so I became a feminist. In this time with you, I'd like to explore little snippets of my academic life in academic medicine and use that as a backdrop for the changing status of women and speculate on future trends in the peculiar moment in which we're allowed to say that the 21st century is the century of biology. Now, I heard Craig Venter say this first. E.O. Wilson may have said it before. Maybe everyone in this room has said it. But as chemistry was so for the 19th century and physics for the 20th, I think this will be true at the end of the century. And we will have cured because of the incredible structures that have been put in place in the 2,500-year march since Hippocrates, we will have cured most of the chronic illnesses by 2100. And the century will have been christened correctly. It was going to be, as you know, really, really simple and elegant in the late 90s. It had to do with the dogma, the fundamental dogma of biology. We were going to find all of the mutations once the genome had been sequenced, and those mutations were going to turn out to cause all of the illnesses in the human experience, and we're going to make three-dimensional drugs in our own laboratories in the university that would fit, as we heard from Dr. Horowitz this morning, lock and key, and stop the culprit proteins from causing whatever illnesses they were making. Of course, the problem was, when the structure of the genome was announced, that there were only 23,000 rather than 100,000 genes. And most illnesses turn out to be a combination of things related to the junk DNA. Interesting that we called it that until only a few years ago, the introns and RNA of virtually every size. And so, you know, we're living in kind of a rehabilitation for Lamarckian evolution with epigenetics, the possibility that our experience can be passed on to the next generation and a few generations more. And it's just a remarkable time. It's a time when we ought to be celebrating the success of this 2,500-year march, and yet conditions, I would suggest, are not so clear. So what does this and the epigenetics and all of these tools suggest about the future? The Xerox Corporation had a wonderful saying. They said the only way to predict the future is to invent it. And so it's difficult to perceive what will happen. Last month at the AAMC annual meeting, the AAMC is the Association of American Medical Colleges, there was a back-to-back set of lectures by these two prominent citizens, Eric Topol from Scripps, who recently published The Creative Destruction of Medicine, and Abraham Verghese, who published Cutting for Stone, kind of an historical, fictional novel. And their visions for the future were extraordinarily in counterpoint. Eric Topol talking about a digital moment when everything that we do and are is being captured somewhere, and that in turn would allow us to become our own physicians, essentially. The end of medicine, the creative destruction of medicine. And Verghese gave a talk about the history of the physical examination and the technologies that had to be invented to do the physical exam, and how critically important listening to the patient and examining the patient as ritual were to still making the diagnosis and giving some comfort to the patients at a moment that might be an extremity, might be near mortality. And it seemed that they were both right. And it made for a very, very interesting set of conversations off of it. But the idea of being able to predict the future is difficult, for sure. We are absolutely at a tipping point. For clinical physicians, we are at a moment when they are as unhappy as a group as any group you could look at through history. 40% of physicians practicing today believe that they will retire within the next 5 years, and the majority of them are under the age of 55. What are the pressures? There are so many. The advent of the Affordable Care Act, mountains of regulation, new data doubling at a rate of under 7 years, making it very difficult to keep a hold of one specialty, declining reimbursement, the advent of team care, and the loss of the autonomy that brought physicians into medical school in the first place. It's a really tough time for doctors, and they're telling us that they are going to go. Part of the Gold Foundation's new mission is to prevent that from happening, in fact, because it would be a disaster for the nation while we are developing responses to the Affordable Care Act and health care reform. Where is the story of women in medicine in this context, at this tipping point, and going forward? So, a few memories. I started medical school in 1970 at NYU. In my class of 160, there were 12 women. There were no female department chairs. There were no women in the dean's office except secretaries. When I came back to the dean's office at NYU 20 years later, things had begun to change slightly. We're speaking early 80s now. And I immediately became involved in sending women to ELAM, the Executive Leadership in Academic Medicine course at Drexel, which had not happened there until that point. We created a Dean's Council on Women to deal with the local issues of bias. Similar activities were going on everywhere. And the federal government got into the fray by passing first the Equal Rights Amendment and then the Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. And let's look at what happened, because it was remarkable. Here's the percentage of applicants to medical school from 1965. Here's 1970. Here's the Equal Rights Amendment. And this is the largest jump in a single 5-year period out to 2010. Look at the shape of that curve. Look how long it took to get to about 50%, which was in 2005. And the fall off is not an accident, as it turns out. The fall off has persisted in 2011 and 2012. What do you find interesting about the shape of this curve and the period of time that passed? Nothing?
It's what happens to women in general, you know, it's in other professions that have traditionally been allocated to this.
Yes, precisely. Look at the length of time it took to get to the percentage of women in the population. 40 years. Why? We need, the sociologists tell us, to be able to try on multiple selves when we are developing our persona. You have to be able to try on the self of being a physician. And if there are no role models, if there are no mentors, if there are no examples in families whom you can look at, you can't try on the role. And so there's a sluggishness, there's a retardation when we're trying to change culture, so that this couldn't possibly have jumped to 50% after Title IX was passed. But it has taken a very long time, and it has fallen off a bit recently. There was a prediction made by the AAMC, and most of these data are from the AAMC with their permission, that the curves would cross in 2007. It took a little bit longer. And that women would thereafter represent a higher percentage of first-time applicants to medical school than men. And that has not happened. And it may not happen for a bit of time longer. Every time there's trouble in the banks, the number of applicants who apply to medical school goes up. And this may be more so for men than women. And maybe that's why this prediction, difficult to predict the future, has not come to pass. But we had at least 1 year, one shining moment when it was 50-50. And where are all of these women in medicine? Well, just looking at the clinical side for a moment, not the science. You probably can't read this. I'll go through this very quickly. But this describes the percent of women residents in each of the specialties in the United States, and compares the percent from 2001 to 2011. So in all these specialties, you wind up at 100%. So family medicine, a decline over that decade from 13 to 10.6%, internal medicine 22.3 to 19.4, but similar declines on the male side. So these are unfavorable specialties. Obstetrics and gynecology, physical medicine and rehabilitation, psychiatry, surgery, a rise from 4.6 to 5.7, and a decline on the male side. Surgery becoming more of a compatible lifestyle for women, I don't know. But if we look at the road specialties, the road to a good life, radiology, ophthalmology, anesthesiology, and dermatology, women appear to be very smart. They occupy a very large segment of these four specialties. In anesthesiology, compared to these, 28% in 01, 40% in 11. Look at dermatology, 55% to 63.5%. These are the trainees who will be populating these fields. Ophthalmology, 32 to 43, and finally, radiology, 25 to 27. So a distribution across the entire set of fields of clinical medicine, and a lot of movement in a decade, especially into the road specialties. What about the academy? This slide describes the representation of women MDs in academic medicine between that moment before the two federal acts in 1965 until 2004. And so for the MD graduates in blue, we see that quick rise with the legislation, and then a smaller slope up until 2004, with women representing 45% in the 21st century. A long lag in women becoming academics, very flat curve, and then a rise to 28% at the same time. This once again representing about a 20-year lag from the time that we were graduating 28% women until they represented 28% in medical schools. Today, Women represent about 39% of full-time academics in medical schools in all fields, basic and clinical science. But this is the same issue, the one of changing culture and how very long it takes to change. This is the ranks of the women in academic medicine. So as of 2012, this is a comparison. The dark bar is 2002, the light bar is 2012. At the instructor level, equality, 54% of the instructors are women. But then as we move to the higher ranks, it falls off. So that in the full professor category, in a decade, women moved from 13 to 20%. And that's a conundrum. Why it takes so long? We spoke this morning about one of the issues, that is, you have the babies, we don't. And despite the consciousness raising that occurred between 1970 and 2000 of men, the burden of child rearing falls on women to a large extent. That is an issue. It is not all of the issues that are responsible for the fall off in that curve. What about where women in academic medicine are? Largest proportion of women faculty are in the specialties on the left: obstetrics and gynecology, 54%, public health and preventive medicine, 52%, and peds, 51%. Fields which have a large piece of prevention in them, though a mixed bag. And the lowest proportion of women faculty are in orthopedics, general surgery, and still radiology. And very, very complex reasons why that might be the case. And what about leadership in academic medicine? So the closest thing to equality with men as assistant deans, comparing in dark 06 to in light 2011. Associate deans fall off, senior associate deans, and full deans of medical schools, only 12%. It's a number like the presidents of universities and AAU universities hit a peak around 2000 and has fallen off slightly in the decade since. Interestingly, department chairs, only 14%, associate or vice chairs, 20%, division and section chiefs, 20%, and this is the basic and clinical sciences. Now, the facetious answer to this is that women are too smart to get involved in these noxious areas of leadership. People who say that describe administration as the dark side. I think that's wrong and unfair. In every field, you want representation of whoever you are at the top. Otherwise, there's never an opportunity to raise the next generation to have that as a goal. So the sluggishness of arriving at 50%, the failure to hit 50% of full professors, there are problems. What about these patterns? What do we know about the patterns? I'm going to quote from the work of Dr. Linda Pololi, who spoke at this meeting last year. She runs the National Initiative on Gender, Culture, and Leadership in Medicine, which they call Sea Change. And they published an article in August, which is extraordinary. It's a landmark piece. 5,000 faculty members across the United States asked to participate in this survey, equal numbers of men and women, published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine, entitled "Experiencing the Culture of Academic Medicine, Gender Matters," or Gender Matters, a national study. And here's what they found as key results, comparing the female faculty to the male faculty. There is a lower sense of belonging and of creating important relationships. There is a lower self-efficacy for career advancement. There is a lower sense of gender equity. There is less likely, a lower likeliness to perceive the institution as family friendly. And all of these were statistically significant in this very, very large study. And these were disturbing, but even more disturbing was the fact that the men are equally unhappy and disaffected and disappointed with their careers at academic medical centers. And so the conclusion is it ain't a very good place to work. And yet the medical center is the teaching laboratory and classroom for all of the specialties that are going to affect biomedicine in the future. So what is this about? Last weekend in the New York Times, Pauline Chen wrote her blog column about her conversation with Linda Polali, and Linda said, "We have this dehumanizing organizational culture in academic medicine that it's hard to ignore the far-reaching consequences of a work environment that has trouble modeling compassion and care." You know, those of us who loved or love the experience of academic medicine, and probably many people in this room, put aside all of the negatives and remember the great mentors, the people who pulled us through, and find it hard to believe that this is the case. But it is. It is in this study, it is in many studies, and it's time really for a revolution. Why does this environment persist? Well, I think it's this machismo that has been embedded in the very fabric of science, in how we do science, in the administration of science, and it's been incorporated multiple times. Russell Crowe as the gladiator amongst the test tubes. It's been incorporated in a whole host of ways that really had the best of intentions. This man, Vannevar Bush, is a national hero. He was science in World War II. He was responsible for the Allies saving the world for democracy, and was given the job of figuring out how to spend huge sums of the nation's tax dollars on science. And 1 year before the end of the war, Franklin Roosevelt asked him to make a blueprint for science after the war. And he used a blueprint that had been around for some time and that he espoused, one in which science should properly be divided into basic and applied in a one-dimensional scale, in which when you move further away from one or the other, you move toward a singularity. One lab, one man, one one idea, and that idea goes out and gets and gets accepted by the funders or not. David Stokes, in the late 90s, proposed that it really was two-dimensional, and that if on the y-axis one plots the relevance of the science for advancement of knowledge, you get in that quadrant pure basic research. Niels Bohr is an example. On the x-axis, relevance for immediate applications, Edison's work and so-called pure applied research, but you wind up with this new quadrant, Pasteur's quadrant, as the book is called, where use-inspired basic research is done, and you don't have to move from one to the other. You can do both in a collaborative, larger sense. And in some ways, I think embedded into the system is the sociological archetyping in which men, through development, have individuation as a goal, and women have connection. As Dr. Schatz was speaking this morning about BioX, I thought about how extraordinary it was, knowing that I was going to talk about this, that the invention of this kind of maximal connectedness is at her hands, and may be capable of changing the environment actually at medical centers. What does this have to do with what I do? These are the characteristics that the Gold Foundation identified as describing a physician who practices with a humanistic approach, requiring integrity, excellence, compassion, altruism, respect, empathy, and service. The ideals that each of us, if we're lucky, have known when being a patient, and which are not necessarily expressed by individual practitioners or the entire healthcare system now. I think for the 21st century, it's not the doctor-patient relationship. It's the relationship among many members of the healthcare team with the patient and with each other, so that we might restate it, that humanism in medicine is a relationship of connectedness that is catalytic in its mutual support. It's the kind of mentoring in the laboratory, mentoring in the clinic, development of relationship, which is precisely the opposite of what Palali discovered in her study with the sea change collaboration. And I think this is what will be necessary in the revolution that occurs in our seats of education in order to move forward. So, what do I think are the implications of this century of biology for women in science? The implications of this remarkable moment, the hope that that different archetype of development might express itself to cure the environment, but the expectation, the full expectation, that there will be equality and women will be judged for their capacity and success, just as men are. Thank you. Questions? Comments?
Are you optimistic?
I am optimistic. I think per force, we're going to see another wave of change now, which will catapult us above magic levels. It only has to do with numbers in the sense that the numbers tell a story about the culture. As people said this morning, it has little to do with quotas or or anything having to do as a derivation with quotas.
Something struck me about the 30-year time period that showed, and that is correlates well to the articles that talk about how long it takes to actually change back into what it's actually moving back into.
Yeah, it's a generation, and some, some have said that you can't actually change culture. That culture is only changed by replacing the people who are living it. I don't want that to be true, but it may be true. I want it to be more of an active process in which all of us grab this and make sure that it improves, but it may be true.
But I think the motivation for change and the mechanisms for change, that's part of the important. It could be that if someone like bioacts gives motivation for change, therefore change. Things just continue the way they are, that people are not incentivized to alter the way of thinking.
Yeah.
I would maintain that the surgery situation is exactly this issue that it was practically 100% male in the worst of ways, least compassionate, most authoritarian. And so that it will take much longer, which is what, of course, is happening.
I would agree. Ken, you were about to say something?
You reminded me of one of my heroes, is Helen Towson. And those was especially with pediatricians. Helen debate Alfred Bell. Such a great hero. But he also had a better sort of pioneer all the techniques of very early years. But I think it's interesting that the woman is the most recent chair surgery at Hopkins. I think there were a lot of pushback. She was named by for people. But as far as I can tell, it's actually one of those.
She established a movement that was successful in each case. She was a surgeon. Yeah, she did surgery, but at least she described the evidence in the book
That was really hard.
Yeah.
description of surgery.
Doesn't she claim she got the job because none of her
Anything else?
And just one of the other comments reminded me of Linda's presentation last year. I think it's really important that men in medicine have these same concerns. This is not just a women's issue, and we talk about it for our best, that this is not a women's issue, it's a science issue. We want better science. We want the best science. And the same thing in medicine, with these issues that we have, what is and what is not attracting women to go into or stay in medicine, are the same for men. What your foundation now is focusing on, which is the environment,
Yeah.
functional medicine. That's the issue.
The question is, to what extent is it RVU that's ruining academic medicine?
The question was, to what extent is the relative value unit, the invention of the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, that describes how much you get paid for anything you do. And there is a large literature now that suggests the way we are paid for piecework and piecework that has to do with procedures rather than cognition at the higher levels has caused much of the problem that you see here. It's a very complex structure.
When I was the chair of the AAMC, the talk I gave was entitled "The Academic Medical Center Will Be an Oxymoron." And it had to do with the fact, not with the basic science departments, but can most medical schools maintain academic clinical science? And it's a huge challenge, which is not getting a whole lot better.
Yeah, huge challenge.
That kind of dovetails to one of my thoughts, and that is, how will the funding climates that are hitting medical schools, certainly academic basic science, it seems as if that would exacerbate many of the sort of things that have been changing that could go backwards. A more competitive climate, a lack of sharing, a lack of communication. Has there been any sort of overlay of what these numbers look like relative to the NIH funding and equivalent dollars, or do you think these two things could be connected?
Well, I think the majority of what deans and CEOs of hospital systems spend their time talking about now is this issue. What is the impact of the cliff? What is the impact of a decline in NIH and NSF dollars? Will it have differential impact? And personally, I think it will not change the possibility of improvement, because at the same time that this is happening, the NIH has made a major change so that large collaborative, large data science can actually happen. And I think that favors bringing in the best from all categories.
I have to mention from the massive three-day session and the visiting at the Hill that if the cut from 32.9 billion for the NIH occurs, that the deans of the medical school will be faced with brand new buildings with brand new names on them, and the indirect costs that are 60% for budgets and cases that drive the people that they need to receive in those beautiful buildings will be affected despite the movement to large installation of groups. And so Professor has really come up with a set of numbers that are quite frightening, that already pre-sequestration, 7% is gone, with 11% moving on getting offset. And it will affect existing plants as well as new ones. And so I think the sobering thought is quite real. I believe in very much.
Yeah, there's no academic medical center, including the top 10, that can pay for the research being done without the government subsidy, which is still a loss leader. So yes, I'm not suggesting it's not going to be hard, and medical schools are going to have to find different ways of covering that, or we will lose another generation of scientists. Yeah. Unless there is a discovery, a new form of energy, fusion, something that will change the economy, I remain steadfastly optimistic that we won't sink to those levels.
Could you comment on humanism, because that is, in your very first statement, what the Gold Foundation addresses. Society has become hugely fractious, and certainly the Congress is sort of setting a pattern that to be raucous and annoying and intrusive In fact, in today's Washington Post, even funerals, the processions, people aren't even obeying the usual politeness of allowing a funeral procession to go by without honking or cutting across or whatever. This certainly is occurring in society broadly, in medicine. What is your foundation doing in addressing this study?
Well, for 25 years, the foundation has worked only within academic medical centers. We are now about to step out into the world beyond to try and use some of the same methods, rituals, in the larger society of practitioners and citizen patients to try and bring back the conversation. While it appears to be a rude age, anyone who's seen Lincoln recently is reminded that, was it ever otherwise? And in politics, as a reflection of the social order, I'm not sure it's really that different, but all of us, certainly physicians, have a responsibility to call it when they see the inhumane activity that is so damaging to the lives of patients, families, and the greater society. And that's what the foundation is trying to teach.